over the last, really 30 years, actually, these two countries, Brazil and Vietnam, kind of became these very low cost producers. And that's what really put the pressure on the price. They're able to produce huge volumes of very cheap coffee. And that's what that's what happened in the early 2000s when there was just, so much coffee. I actually remember in 2002 when I had just started working for TechnoServe, hearing that Brazil was going to produce maybe 50 million bags of
Oh,
coffee.
wow.
And that was seen as, such a massive amount. It was going to
Yeah.
result in huge surpluses, that, the market really crashed.
If the content we bring you on the podcast has helped you with your business or your career and you're looking for a way to financially support the independent production of this podcast, you can do that for as little as a few dollars a month by backing us on Patreon or becoming a paid subscriber on our YouTube channel. Another way to support us and continue your learning is to purchase one of our on-demand workshops available on our website, mapitforward.coffee/workshops. Check the show notes for links, and as always, thanks for the support. Welcome to the Daily Coffee Pro by Map It Forward, friends. I'm your host, Lee Safar, and this is episode 3 of a fantastic 5-part series with Paul Stewart, the Global Coffee Director for TechnoServe. In this series, we're talking about the poverty amongst coffee farmers. And in this particular episode, we're going to be asking this question: why is this such a hard problem to solve? One thing that we definitely have been hearing from what are supposed to be the next generation of coffee farmers is things like, I don't want to work as hard as my parents did for less return than what they did, Paul. Is that the kind of thing that you're seeing with smallholder farmers? Are you seeing something different to that?
No, I think that's absolutely true. And particularly given the fact that farm sizes have become smaller and smaller. Actually, it's even a case of, young people growing up on those farms, they see themselves because even, their parents who might be becoming much older, getting, might even be elderly, they've never had the opportunity in recent years to save money. And, they don't have a pension fund. So they actually need to keep farming the land. And it means that, young people often in many communities, they just don't have the opportunity to continue coffee farming. And that's really tough. And it's interesting, in places like Kenya, we see that, young people, they go to Nairobi or other towns and get jobs, whatever jobs they can. They're often earning, really low incomes, but, they have no opportunities at home, and they'll work for a number of years. And then at the point where they inherit their parents' farm, then they'll go back and they will start farming at maybe 50 years old. And so actually a lot of farmers who we train
Wow.
in Kenya are in their 50s and 60s, and they are just really starting out as farmers.
Are we seeing that as technology like AI starts to evolve? Are we starting to see farmers that are coming back, regardless of age, that are taking over the farms? Are we seeing them reimagine the income potential of a farm? Or are we seeing them continue the same traditions as the generation before them?
I think there is certainly a small minority of farmers who are young people who have gone out, had a career somewhere and come back to the farm. And obviously those are going to be people who have the opportunity to farm, a larger than average farm size and bring, some of that experience and entrepreneurship, and new technologies they've learned about to the farms. But, unfortunately, that is very much the minority.
Okay. So then if we look at what this problem is, when we look at your 4 points from the previous episode,
Yeah.
why is this? And we connect that to the fact that coffee consumption is going up. Why is this such a hard problem to solve? Because we know the demand is there.
Yeah.
And we don't know yet how elastic coffee is going to be given these new prices. We were right in the middle of starting to begin the journey of figuring that out when the tariffs showed up, right? So why is this such a difficult problem to solve?
Yeah, so let's look at those four components of profitability that we talked about in the last episode. So price, yield, costs, and land size. And let's kind of just think about, why this is so hard to solve. So price, if we think about, well, why are prices, like half the level, or, even 20 years ago, they were, a quarter or even less of the level that they were 50 years ago. What changed? And, can we change it back? I guess is the obvious question. Well, what changed was two things happened. One was innovation and mechanization in Brazil. Over the last 50 years, while most of the world productivity, yields on farms stayed the same, in Brazil, they invested massively in research and development and in all kinds of technologies, which has resulted in Brazilian farms having a yield today 4 times what they were 50 years ago. So their yield has really gone up a lot. The other thing that's happened in the last 50 years is Vietnam appeared in the early 1990s as this very low cost producer. So, over the last, really 30 years, actually, these two countries, Brazil and Vietnam, kind of became these very low cost producers. And that's what really put the pressure on the price. They're able to produce huge volumes of very cheap coffee. And that's what that's what happened in the early 2000s, when there was just, so much coffee. I actually remember in 2002, when I had just started working for TechnoServe, hearing that, Brazil was going to produce maybe 50 million bags of coffee.
Oh, wow.
And, and that was seen as, such a massive amount. It was going to result in huge surpluses that, the market really crashed. The funny thing is, a year or so ago, when the announcement was made that Brazil was going to produce 50 million bags, the market shot up because the world
it's not
is
enough.
consuming so much more coffee now that 50 million bags was going to mean there was going to be a deficit of coffee in the world. So that dynamic is a hard thing to change. You can't, in the last 20, 30 years, you couldn't, farmers couldn't stop Brazil or Vietnam being these low cost producers who were able to just deliver coffee much lower than anyone else. But, I think we can maybe address this later. It's unclear that Brazil and Vietnam are going to continue to be in those roles. Brazil, obviously with drought problems over the last 4 years, they just haven't been able to continue to produce more and more coffee, and who knows if they will be able to. So there's a certain level of unpredictability, I think, around the price, but it's certainly outside of the control of farmers in other parts of the world.
There is a kind of movement that's happening at the moment for local consumption of coffee. Do we see that could be something that could potentially be a solution for these problems?
Yeah, look, Brazil is the second biggest consumer of coffee in the world after the US, and that's fantastic, because it means they're able to produce a lot of coffee in Brazil, which is consumed near home, so the costs are low, and it's able to absorb a lot of the coffee that Brazil produces. And we're definitely we're seeing coffee consumption pick up in other producing countries, but it's certainly a lot slower than we've seen in Brazil. But it is great that when you go to producing countries around the world, you can find specialty coffee shops now, which 10 years ago you couldn't. So there is an indication there that consumption is definitely picking up in those countries.
And with the tariffs doing what they're doing, I assume that that's now a serious consideration for a country like Vietnam.
Yes, well, look, Vietnam exports, I think, probably about 10% of their coffee to the US. So that will somewhat temper, I think, the impact. But 10% of Vietnam's production is a lot of coffee. So where, they're going to have somewhat limited options of where to sell that coffee. Perhaps it's helped a little bit that production in Vietnam has been kind of somewhat stagnant the last couple of years.
Right.
So with the market growing in other places, maybe that helps a little bit to find other markets. But for sure, Vietnam, yeah, with such high tariffs, it's just not going to be attractive for companies in the US to buy that coffee.
So speaking of which, who is incentivized to solve this problem? Because clearly we have a disconnect between the ability to supply and the motivation to supply based on such hard terrain, economic, agricultural, fiscal, all of it. All of it's difficult on the producing side. But then on the consuming side, there's a demand that's insatiable. So who is incentivized to solve this problem?
I think it's a tough question. I'm not sure I'm able to answer that one. But I think, in terms of the specific challenges that exporters and importers are facing right now with the tariffs, we're definitely going to see changes in where people are buying their coffee. We're in particularly, I think of like Indonesia, where if the tariff stays at 32%, buyers in the US who are buying specialty coffees, it's just going to be really hard for them to continue to buy Indonesian coffees. Like, how do you put that product on the shelf with such a higher price than other products? So I think, for sure, farmers are going to be impacted in Indonesia, farmers who are producing those higher quality coffees who, that have been traditionally going to the US. I actually reached out to a friend who has a small exporting company in Aceh in Indonesia, who works with farmers, helping them to produce high quality coffees and export them to high-end markets. And yeah, I felt so sorry for him, thinking about the impact this could have on his business. Now, fortunately, he let me know he has customers all around the world, in Japan and Korea and places. So it'll be, the impact won't be so severe. But for sure, there will be farmers in those higher tariff countries are they're going to have a challenge selling their coffee. But it could also result in farmers in other places benefiting. I really wonder if, importers in the US specialize in buying Robusta coffees. Maybe they will shift to buying Robusta coffees from Uganda, which have traditionally been more expensive than Vietnam, but perhaps with such a big tariff, it could actually, tip the balance and make Ugandan coffee. So maybe Ugandan farmers will benefit from that. So it's a bit hard to know how things are going to play out.
When it comes to solving the problems that we've got, what role does an NGO like yours play in helping to facilitate? Because I assume that's a part of the role that you guys play, right? Like, your job is to help understand how to connect somebody who's got a solution to a problem with the person who needs to have that problem solved.
Right. Yes. Look, on this specific challenge of tariffs, I think the one country where we work where farmers and exporters are going to be really affected is Nicaragua. Nicaragua tariff rate has been set at 19%. And a challenge there is that about 50% of Nicaragua's coffee goes to the US. So we're definitely going to be working with, exporters and cooperatives there to help them to find other markets, frankly. And I think that's maybe the role that we can help them with.
And what about the wider problem that needs to be solved? What role do you as an NGO play? Because we're asking this question, like, why is it so hard to solve? Is this wider problem, does it facilitate the need for the TechnoServes and the Cup of Excellences of the world to get their hands like in there and try and help solve these problems? Is that the point?
Yeah, absolutely. Look, we started off talking about price and how you can, that's a really hard problem to solve. But I think, one of the other ones obviously is yield. That's the other big problem that so many smallholder farmers have. And as you mentioned, changing weather patterns, more frequent droughts, even, more frequent, rainfall or heavier rainfall at times, is really starting to affect farmers. And that's making things much harder, these weather events. And it's also really hard for farmers to, obviously, if they haven't changed their yields, they haven't been able to increase them in the last 50 years. There's a reason for that, and often it's because of lack of knowledge. It's not just a lack of access. It's not often, it certainly access to finances to be able to invest in their farm is certainly a constraint for many farmers. But often it's just a basic lack of knowledge on the key practices that are going to help farmers to the farms to increase productivity. And as an illustration of that, of how hard this is to fix, I remember, after working in East Africa for many years, I went to Peru some years ago for the first time. It was my first visit to Latin America, excuse me. And, I imagined, wow, Latin America, things are going to be so much more advanced. Farmers are going to have so much more knowledge than the farmers, I had experience working with in East Africa. And I remember the very first farm that I visited, and it was in a fairly remote part of Peru, admittedly. And I was talking to the farmer and looking around his farm, and he, as part of explaining about issues he was having on his farm, he explained that that every year the leaves fall off the trees. And I'm standing with him looking at his trees, and it was true. They had no leaves. And I asked him, well, what do you think is the reason for this? And he said, I don't know. It's just something, it's a natural thing. Every year the leaves fall off the tree. And I'm looking at it and I'm thinking, this is because rust disease in your trees. And he didn't know. And, and that's a hard challenge. Like, maybe it's not that hard to overcome, but it's hard when you think of there are millions and millions of smallholder farmers out there
who don't have the information.
That they lack that information. And how do you deliver that to smallholder farmers, many of whom are illiterate in many of the countries we work with? And they need to learn by seeing and often by doing to really understand and believe it, because many of the things that, for me, I can stand on a farm and think it's completely obvious of what your problem is and very obvious what the solution is. Often it's counterintuitive. And I think another good example of that is in many parts of East Africa, farmers have way too many stems on their coffee. So that's the vertical kind of branches. And now,
so they don't stump.
They don't stump. They might actually rejuvenate, but the problem is they have way too many stems on their tree. And we see this in places like Uganda and Kenya, so because farmer thinks, well, if I have 5 or 10 stems on my tree, that's going to produce more coffee. Well, it's totally counterintuitive, but actually 2 or 3 is the maximum number of stems you can have in your tree to get the maximum production. So, how does a farmer learn that? How do they, really understand it? That's a tough problem to overcome, and it requires investment in training. It's not just, call all the farmers to a big meeting of, 1,000 farmers and explain these things. Like, no one learns that way. You have to learn by seeing and doing, and that takes a bit more investment. So that's a tough problem to solve. And maybe just to quickly mention on the other, the other
Please.
Components we talked about. Yeah. So costs, why is it so hard to solve the problem of, increasing costs? Well, we mentioned weather issues. It means farmers need to invest in regenerative practices. And often that actually means more work, producing compost and going and finding the materials for that.
Biochar, blah, blah, blah.
Yeah, getting your hands on shade tree seedlings and planting those, it's a lot of work and investment. So, it's getting harder and harder for farmers to just maintain the yields that they have, and they have to even invest more, and that's really tough. And then the fourth component was land size. Well, maybe that's stating the obvious. It's really hard to change. How do you make bigger farms? You can't just throw people off the land to create larger farms. That's not a solution. And it's a problem that's bigger than the coffee industry. I believe it's something that, it can only be solved through creating more economic opportunities and jobs in the wider economy that will provide opportunities for farmers, to actually leave their land and allow consolidation to happen.
And
But that's
such
tough.
volatility that we're experiencing in the world, in general at the moment, and in the coffee market, particularly in the context of our discussion, volatility is not an environment that you want to be making any kind of firm decisions or long-term decisions for the future, right?
Right. I think that's absolutely true. And it's true for, it's true for farmers. Although, look, if farmers are earning higher incomes now, because the price has gone up, then, the farmers themselves, they have the opportunity to really invest that money. But I think when you go up the supply chain, and when I think of, many of the coffee roasters who fund some of the type of work that TechnoServe does, this is a really hard time for them to actually invest in sustainability work and to invest in solving some of these really difficult long-term problems. They're just struggling to keep their heads above water at this time.
Yeah. Okay. So another amazing episode, but we're going to head into the next episode. So join us for that. And we're going to talk about, do farmers have a choice where and how to sell their coffee? This is a fascinating concept. So join us for that, folks. Peace, love, and peanut. Let me do that again. Peace, love, and peanut butter. Have an amazing rest of your day. I really hope you enjoyed this episode, friends. Please don't forget to show us some love by subscribing, liking, commenting, and most of all, sharing this podcast with your friends. Check the show notes for links, including our sponsors and our Patreon. And stay tuned for more great conversations on the Daily Coffee Pro by Map It Forward.